All right, Matt. So we were talking off air, but now, fully on air for everybody. So those that don't know, please introduce yourself and where you're at, and then we will kind of just jump into the questions.
Awesome, man. Well, thanks very much for having me. And Matt Pell. I'm currently working for Catapult Sports over here in North America, and it's a really kind of mixed role, I suppose, in terms of what I do. It's everything from running webinars, probably similar to you guys at the moment, all the way through to my account management and projects that come with that. I suppose in terms of the sports that I look after, it's all of Major League Soccer over here. It's really growing at a fast rate, all the way through to American football. And as I mentioned to you guys just before, like a good handful of universities. So projects go far and beyond. I'm really connected, obviously, to the product development side, plus obviously what we're trying to do for innovation with the product as well. So but I think, as we all know, there's a difference probably between having Catapult and actually using it.
I want Catapult because that's what everybody else has.
Exactly. And I think that's really where some of my conversations open up in the industry. But it's been an interesting role, interesting transition. I say that because there is so much genuine development that I see in my own experiences, plus getting out of the context that I've come from previously as well, which is obviously a long way from here.
So, there's been this presentation and us talking shop again has kind of seemed like, a couple of months in the making between, like I said, off air, me going to your guys' conference in January, and then, Higginbotham speaking extremely highly of you as you just got to see him. What kind of drove you into getting into this role? And, for our listeners and members, like kind of tease it and sell like, hey, if this is what's starting to grow in the field, or, we 10 years ago, we were talking right off air about Rob and how it was GP Sport and how things have evolved. And I remember when I took over at Iowa with this stuff with GP Sport, apparently, what we were telling everybody, what we said was like, I think it was LSU, Florida State, and Oregon. There was like 4 schools of American football. And so, that was 2012, 2013. And now 10 years later, like, where's it going? What, like, how can people get into the role? What do you see? That's just one of the couple questions I got for you.
Yeah, it's a really interesting one because, like, I suppose to really wind the clock back and where I started, I suppose, coming over to America, honestly, was nearly 10, it's probably nearly 12 years ago now.
What made you want to come over here? If you're like, if I'm interrupting you and you're going to already get to that, then I'll shut up. But
no, it's a great question. First and foremost, it was my honeymoon. So I come over here with my wife. Obviously, we got married a long time ago now.
That's got to be the coolest answer we've heard yet, Fernando. Like, because
I thought he was gonna be honest and say because Australians just love American sports. That's what.
No. It's like I always had an appreciation for it, no doubt about it. And I think it really did stem from there. I remember I was working with the AFL referee department at the time, and I met with Fordham University and the New York Jets.
You met with universities on your honeymoon?
I actually did.
Holy shit, your wife is fucking amazing. Holy shit.
Yep, she is. And I was like, I'm coming all this way. How could I not? So
you're on your honeymoon.
Yeah, I know. It's bad, but I was like, 3 weeks. Yes, don't get me wrong. I love
okay. That's a totally different story. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, okay. Spot on. So it's it was amazing, obviously, experience at the time, and I had an experience like obviously what the culture was like, and just to up close and see what it's like. I was just really interested in, because clearly when you've been living in Australia for a long time, you know that system really well, and was just keen to look at something a little bit different, and that's where it certainly stemmed my interest from then on. I suppose working through the AFL system for then obviously 10 years plus after that, I had never really thought about it until I got an opportunity to come over here in an off season. And I'd probably been over here for some professional development. Like in AFL, you're very fortunate to have some funding to be able to spend as a part of your contractual arrangements. I'm not saying that probably happens everywhere, but I certainly did in our departments. But you could come over, you could spend that however you want. Masters, go and do some further education, or obviously go and conduct some professional development. And we saw that probably as an opportunity to bring that back to the department in terms of the information sharing, and really specific that you identified the areas of development as well. So for me, we're spending some time at Altus with Dan Paff and Stu McMillan, guys like that, and rubbing some shoulders with how I thought.
When did you get to do that? What years?
That was in 2000. So 2006, 17, I went to the Vern Gambetta conference.
Okay.
And then it would have been in 2000 and end of 2017 going into 2018 is when I come over to the to do the Altus level 1.
Yeah, that apprenticeship program.
Yep,
Okay.
spot on. So that was awesome, man, and got to spend a week obviously with coaches there, and obviously I was working the return to play continuum in the AFL, and I just injected like you look at the whole dribbling series and obviously the implementation of that and the coaching of that. I thought was a really different way, I suppose, that we taught, not necessarily that different, but there was aspects of it that you're just taking bits and pieces and you're injecting it into the guys you're working with. I thought there was just so much benefit. And I spoke to a couple of guys, obviously, around what courses were out there, and that obviously as a coach, that definitely attracted to me to doing that at the time. So I honestly think from then on, I come over 2 years after that, and that was to go to another workshop in LA and also meet with the LA Rams and the LA Angels. And had an opportunity in there, and I've got to thank Jamie Hepner, who's the director of applied sports science at Catapult. He was the one who obviously called me when I got back to Australia, and and
Because
honestly,
Jamie lives over here in America, right?
He does, man. Yeah, he does. So he's Michigan bound now.
He's in Michigan, yeah, because he was the guy that was kind of running point of the conference that you guys have in January, right?
Correct. Yeah. So he looks after obviously for Catapult, all of our NFL clients over here. Yep. And he's done a terrific job at building that up, because it's grown from being a couple literally to where it's at today, where we're pretty much working with every club on obviously the wearable front, plus obviously the video aspect. So
yeah, that's going to be something that we got to talk about for sure.
Yeah. So yeah, for me, man, it was kind of right fit, right time. Like, been working obviously in the system for a long time, was prepared to give something a bit different a go, and the other side of it as well, having 2 kids. We just thought it was a really good opportunity for the kids to go and experience a different culture, and knowing that it's an English speaking language, it made sense. So we made the call, and obviously I, like you, Coach, I had the opportunity to come over and present at that workshop a couple of years ago as well. Nice. Flew back to Australia, packed up the house, and then literally come back a couple of months later, and was here we are today.
How old are your kids?
8 and 6.
Okay, and you said you're in Charlotte right now?
Yep, I am.
How far away is that from Elon and where DeMarco's at?
Oh, geez, that's a good. It'd be. How far? Oh, it'd be a couple of hours. I think.
Is it? Yeah, because I mean, DeMarco's got young kids around that age too, and it seems like a great area to live. So I'm sure you guys picked a good spot.
Yeah, spot on. So it's quite central, obviously, as you know.
You had mentioned, Jamie's name, and I talked about Rob. There's a couple of people that I've worked with before, like Mina and Emma. Sure, our listeners, again, like you said, not only has Jamie grown the NFL side of it, but a lot of our listeners have it, right? Like, it doesn't matter what level you're at. I mean, I'm FCS football, and we have, the full blown, and we've got over 50 units. Kind of talk about the different members and who you're talking to and what you're going to get when you get a Catapult rep. Because again, now let's not only talk to our current listeners and members that have Catapult, for those that are on the fence, like, hey, kind of give them the pitch of how, why you guys, what are some of the things that they can get from the benefit of having you?
Yeah, it's really up to them as to how they want to utilize it. And I think that's where I've been honestly honoured in terms of the call that I did get at the time, because they did obviously identify trying to get some experience into this role. And I'm not saying that this is probably pretty evident with most technology companies that are out there, where you are absolutely getting some pretty fresh people coming out of the industry that are transitioning, because this is kind of their in terms of the I suppose just getting some client interactions, but also obviously just the account management side, because there is a lot of the logistical pieces, as clearly you know, in running, like when shit breaks, who do I call? But then at the same time, like, how do we actually utilize this product at a deep enough level, and who can it influence? And I think, honestly, that's why Jamie, like, obviously identified what we need, and getting some experience in, and knowing that with my background had worked across that return to play aspect, plus obviously the performance management aspect of overseeing a team and utilizing that big picture piece of the puzzle on your periodization plan and beyond. That is a real advantage, I suppose, for now. Some of my conversations, when I walk into a team and we're having conversations based around how do we utilize the product, because it can influence coaching, it can influence strength coaches, and then much deeper in terms of medical. And I look after most of the SEC football programs with my account management, and I just got off the phone literally this morning speaking to a whole medical department with regards to the implementation of Catapult. So
That's awesome.
What are they looking at? How are they using it? But depending on which injuries, these are the questions that are certainly coming my way.
Yeah, so I imagine like this is something that's happened over time. And of course, if you consider other sciences or other things have been implemented, even though technology changes the way we see stuff, and even with sports changing, athletes' bodies changing, calendars changing, and the world and whatnot, do you guys have anyone specific or the specific department in the company, or do you work as in like, you know, partners with the people you work with to sort of like interpret the data, right? Because as technology gets shared by everyone, it would be, you know, easy to assume that competition would be able to sort of like measure the same things or similar things, but interpretation is the key. I know a lot of people can turn on a unit, download, upload, it's like learning to use a phone, but then
Like you
where
said, having Catapult versus using Catapult.
yeah, or like
Mhm.
where like the genuine conclusions come, or where do you see what you want to see, or you're actually interpreting like, you know, high axles, for example, lead into this, lead into that, or variables that are linked to any side of, because you're talking about RTP and medical and whatnot, but you know, I've read some sports don't really consider total distance, some others do. They both have a point for and against, like for it or against it. So how do you guys work around that?
Yeah, honestly, it probably does come a little bit back to the individual practitioner as well. And I talk about, like, obviously reflect on that experience, because like I've been involved in obviously these departments, like back in Australia where you've got a team of physiotherapists. We don't have athletic trainers in obviously in Australia, and then your strength and conditioning staff that are really having to dabble into that return to play aspect and understanding, not to the physiotherapist or the physical therapist degree of pathology, but understanding like where the injury is at, what do I need to do to rebuild this guy, and to get him back, as they're a wide out, it's got to run a heap of like go routes, and how much speed can he actually handle. So those aspects for us, for me personally, coming into that role to provide some further layers into that conversation, I think are really beneficial, certainly for my customers that I'm working with. Now, can everyone do that? And depending on their background, potentially not. But that's something I think we try to pride ourselves on, is our internal collaboration as well here at Catapult, because we've got a really beautiful opportunity to be able to cross collaborate and network as well with a multitude of practitioners, where we'll bring people into the tent and obviously have high level conversations, whether it's about like certain metrics or it's about context. And we're talking about game plans and strategies. I had conversation just a couple of days ago with an MLS customer, with a coach, based around what is their philosophy of their game plan, because how our metrics complement your game plan is something that like practitioners really need to understand. And particularly when we sign up a new customer as well that's coming into this field of performance, we're going to educate potentially this coaching staff. And you only have to look at the MLS over the last sort of few years. You've got the addition of Austin FC, you've got Nashville, we've had Charlotte FC coming in this year, we've got, there's St. Louis coming in next year, and then you've got potentially Vegas coming in the year after. So how you're onboarding and educating these practitioners as the industry is growing, I think it's really incumbent on us to know our stuff in areas, but also how we go about educating that ecosystem of coaching staff and medical staff and performance staff that we're working with.
Who are the easiest coaches, strength and conditioning practitioners or medical staff that, and again, I'm not saying name names, but like, what are some of the qualities of the easiest and best coaches you work with, vice versa, some of the worst coaches that you guys have to deal with? Who are the ones that you're like, man, if you're a listener out there, hey, you should be doing, be like these guys, X, Y, and Z. You don't have to say who it is. And hey, if you really want to do a bad job, don't do what, don't do these qualities. Kind of list it out for who the best and the worst for you guys.
Difference between buying Catapult and using Catapult.
Yeah.
It's all coming back. It's a circle. It's a circle.
That's it. Like, I think clearly being in this role, you see so much of the industry in terms of the exposure, which we don't take for granted. Like, you can't take that for granted either. Like, the exposure is unbelievable. And I think that's where we have to be respectful as well. Obviously I certainly am in terms of each organization. It's really understanding, because each organization is different. And whether it's at the university level or whether it's a professional team sport, everyone does things differently. And I'm talking about systems and the way that obviously they've set up the messaging to the head coach, obviously the messaging from medical, and understanding that context in our role is really critical to support obviously our practitioners, but obviously how we could be utilized in that conversation as well, because some people will see it as a threat, no doubt about it. But that's where I think it gets back to relationships, and it's really understanding who we're trying to support and how we're trying to support them to be able to inevitably achieve the end goal. So I think, to answer your question, like, the ones who I see doing it really, really well are the open and the collaborative ones, who actually genuinely don't think they know it all and want to be able to dive into a performance conversation, because sometimes their challenges are going to be totally different as to the way that they're obviously communicating to their head coach. But how do they get through that? Have they thought about something a little bit different? And I think, like, clearly with some of your audience, no doubt, that's listening in, that have heard my conversations previously, like, there are some big challenges there in terms of how they present that. And load management is one piece of the puzzle, let alone trying to speak to a medical team as to how they could utilize Catapult. And sometimes they might get it, sometimes they might not. But having someone who's seen things a little bit differently, plus obviously the experience across the industry, we're just throwing up potential suggestions, and it's up to them how they want to utilize it. But I genuinely think the more open and collaborative you are, the more interaction that can happen in our environment, I think, is personally more beneficial for the client as well.
Two things that I thought about when you were talking about that. One, for any of the staffs, whether it's college or professional, have you noticed that the ones that have any turnover, whether it be with head sport coach or head athletic, and you know how that cycle goes, if there's a new head coach, usually it's a new staff, and maybe if they stay, have you found that the staffs where there's consistency with either ownership or athletic directors, do they do a better job? And then the second question is, what do you tell the people that you work with, the physios, the strength coaches, what do you tell them to get the best out of, using Catapult when the head sport coach won't actually collaborate and won't be open? Because that's what you said, the worst don't do. So how do you still advise?
Yeah, and it's a really tricky balance. Like sometimes, like the conversation in my shoes, I can only speak from personal, obviously, and I'm coming from a very different context. So I haven't lived and breathed, obviously, in their environment in terms of what that does look like. And you've really got to understand that. And I think
do you get any pushback being like having the, I mean, again, I know for me, I was able to tell like, hey, you have an Australian accent. Do you have any American football coaches into like, no, I'm not listening to that guy. Like he doesn't understand my sport, right? Like, cause I wouldn't put it beyond them.
No, absolutely. Absolutely. It has happened. So, and do I take offense to that? Like, I think you've got to have a thick enough skin as well to turn around and say, well, that's your own prerogative. Like, it's not my program. But am I actually going to be involved in the conversations where it could open up and really dive into the weeds? I genuinely think to help support my guys, absolutely. I will go as deep as I need to go. And clearly, I hope that obviously the way that this conversation has evolved and the information that's fed back to you with my guys out there is that I'm prepared to support them as deep as we need to go. Now, that opens up, like Catapult is one aspect to this, the way I see it, because you've got so many parameters and obviously components of technology under the performance umbrella. Like Catapult is probably one piece of the puzzle. So how are you managing the broader picture of load as well in terms of like injury collation and analysis through to obviously force plates and the sequencing of that across your microcycle? Like it really is such a diverse role, but inevitably we're there to help and go as deep as we need to go. So yeah, I've kind of probably done a bit of a 360 in your answer in my response, but that kickback and those conversations, like they're going to happen hopefully over time, and I'm sure that they're not going to happen all the time either. That's up to us to manage that relationship as well, but we're there to support, and I think that's the most critical aspect that I've learned in terms of coming into this role in a different context. Like I've never worked in football, but the first thing I did when I got over here, as my guys will know, I actually designed a whole periodization program, and I said, look, I'm going to try and plan out Catapult data to try and understand what I would do based on your schedule, and then let alone how I'm going to rehab a guy coming back from hamstring injury, and probably the way I look at it, and present that back to them to create some dialogue and start to get some feedback. And obviously there could have been some potential learnings in there for the practitioner who might not have thought about some of these aspects previously. So that performance conversation has absolutely led into having genuine conversations with head football coaches, because that trust is then developed, which is something I'm really big on, which then opens up the conversation to go even further.
One of the topics that, go ahead, Fernando. Go ahead.
So then again, like time is relative, but if we were to be analyzing this in a longitudinal way, like you still like on the ice-breaking mode, right? Just like punching into new sports, into new markets, into new countries. So you probably don't want extremes on either end. Like, so the people that don't take it, like, I know the sport, I don't need numbers, like whatever, are the people that just live or die by it, I remember when I was brought to one of my jobs, not mentioning anyone, I was brought to do that. So you got people that use it as a skill, and now in some sports, it's a job for someone. Like GPS is a job. Like the person is hired yearly just to look at that. You can look at anything. But I remember the coach bringing me in, and he was like, I actually know how we run and like who's aerobic, but I just want to have the numbers. And I'm like, what's that even supposed to mean? Like you've never measured a session ever or a game, but you know it. So my first year was just pretty much exploring, because how can I say what's a lot, what's too little if I've never read anything? So like we needed volume and time for relevance and data. And then after that, after a couple of years, I actually became with a profile. I said, like, we actually don't need to do more than this, because we will never need to do more than this. We could run 40K a week, but if the highest week we've ever had was 30. I mean, and you have an 8-week preseason, like, and you think in your principles are like, do I want to do volume first? How long do I have? When you have control, you know what I mean? Like, and then after that, the other extreme is like reward or punish through metrics. And I just tell them, like, to be honest, it's interpretation. Because if I show you 2 different games and I tell you which one did we win, it's impossible to guess. I mean, you can adjust. It's like being a lawyer, you know. You can adjust your conclusion to either one once you know the answer, but you can't really tell because if we play better decision making, we probably made less running unless we scored more tries and then we ran more.
Yeah, but and you're trying to sell the story, so to speak.
Yeah.
Like, is there that confirmation bias and obviously like creating that story to say, well, we need this, obviously, but. Like the way I look at it, it's because obviously to dive into that and really unpack it a little bit further, like you've got, particularly when you're starting out with a new client who's really trying to figure out exactly where this is. And like I say to them from the word go, like you are going to get to a stage where you've invested in like the technology. And obviously, as you said, you've quantified the game demands and you've really looked at the detail, obviously, in the sport in terms of quantifying volume, density, and intensity. But inevitably, how are you using it to drive performance? That's what I'm interested in. And what do those performance conversations actually look like? For you to go to the head coach or to you to actually challenge your medical staff and say, well, do we need to accelerate this return to play continuum? What does that look like? Going, well, we've not done enough high-speed running. This is what we need to do based on the game demands. And by the time we need to reverse engineer the sport, or it's going, well, you've said we're going to be back in 2 weeks or 4 weeks' time. There's no way they're going to be prepared if we've been tracking from day one. So therefore, it presents the conversation in multiple areas that I think like that's where I've definitely seen the investment, obviously, in the practitioner's role. They are full-time now. They're being hired. Like the Catapult have done, no doubt, a really good job at growing sports science in the industry and getting, obviously, the practitioner another skill set in order to keep that growing out.
What are the the top 3 things when I asked Zach, like, hey, what are some of the best things that Matt really can speak on and that I should be asking him to help everybody else out? The first thing he says was high performance culture, and we've kind of been talking about it, but what have been, again, some of the best and the worst and just the best piece of advice for our listeners out there of how to create the right high performance culture? We've kind of teased it, talking, and we've kind of teased tactical periodization. That was another thing that he wanted to talk about, but I think those two really go well together. So, from your experience, how do you see those two working the best?
Yeah, it's honestly, it's probably the biggest debate in the industry as well, because again, I'm just exposed to so many different conversations, but like speaking from experience and I've got to pay testament to the performance managers that I've worked under as well, because I have learned a lot from them in terms of leadership and culture, but also I'm talking about like the detail that actually comes into your programming and your systems and the communication that happens within those environments, because it is very dynamic and at the same time you need people who can actually get along and challenge each other at the same time, but inevitably at the end of the day, put your egos aside and we're all trying to achieve the same thing, but how do we actually get through it? So the Australian system is very different. Like it really is. You're looking at your head of strength and conditioning, particularly in the AFL system, who really has a very big, I suppose, foot at the table with the head coach. So they're very aligned in terms of what's happening within the whole running of the program. And in conjunction with their strength, conditioning and sports science and obviously medical. So all of that information is essentially being fed through to that one performance manager, who then obviously is going to the head coach. to be able to manage and audit, obviously, the roster, the list, to be able to present the players to the practice training session and say, yep, he can do this, and then we start to go through it. So now, obviously, you apply that, and this is where I've seen this implemented in Major League Soccer since I've been over here, and I know exactly who is doing that well at that level. And I think you only have to look at obviously the ladder at the moment in terms of the schedule. I think those teams definitely up the top have it together. But I suppose in a football context, it is very different, and it's very I suppose that's an area that I'm really interested in as to how that communication does. The more I get out into the industry, how does that unfold? And I'm not saying that there is a right and wrong answer there. All I'm interested in is how, particularly on the load management side, how that communication cycle does go, because typically you've got a head of athletic trainer, you've got a head strength coach, and then they're both doing the messaging through to the head coach. So I'm really big on clarity. So if the head coach is hearing the same thing from both people, what does that look like? And in terms of being across load management, is that their area of medical? How is that then brought together in terms of systems and processes? And like you speak to Zach, like how he's organising his meetings now with his medical team, to give like one little insight without giving it all away, but having regular conversations and prioritising, like on a Monday and a Friday, we're catching up, we're reviewing programs, and we're talking about these systems and processes and progressions. That's a piece of the performance management piece that I see being so critical to understanding. And I think to a certain degree, we should nearly change our language on load management. It should be prescription management, and how we actually go about managing the athlete, whether it's in a return to play continuum, or obviously what the script design does look like for the day. So those pieces of the puzzle, I think, in terms of that performance management aspect, there's some key responsibilities there that I see even the strength coaches being able to dabble into the mid to end stage of the return to play, and understanding the mitigating of risk of injury and reoccurrence. They're across football really, really well and really detailed, and the position-specific requirements that go with that. So I think that's a huge piece of the puzzle that they can add some benefit in. Does it always fit under medical? Absolutely not. But then you've got some really qualified athletic trainers who have dabbled in the strength and conditioning side and could potentially do that mid to end stage. So I think there is as long as both of those departments can get on with each other, I think that's really critical as well.
Yeah, maybe it's a little bit of confirmation bias for myself, but I've had a similar conversation with my head athletic trainer where I essentially told him, I'm like, look, when we're in the off season and they're not practicing football and I am training the entire team at once, you're essentially a strength coach for the guys that need that end of stage rehab, right? Like what we're doing, you understand our regression, like we've worked together on this. I go, but vice versa, when we're in season and you guys are on the field, making sure everybody else that is in practice is being healthy and you're evaluating injuries. But now I'm essentially an athletic trainer doing that end stage rehab. Like there is that ebb and flow. And again, it's a little bit of that vagueness, but you also tease that third area that Zach said, talk to him about return to play. Who are those best programs? Again, you don't name names if you don't want to, or whatever you want to say, but like, what is the overall principles that you have seen best with that continuum? Because I know there's a ton of strength coaches or PTs, physios, ATCs that are like, hey, this is my area, your area. Like, I have my feeling and our members and listeners, but from your perspective and how they integrate the data and what they're doing, what does it look like?
Yeah, I think Zach might have actually done this in one of his previous webinars too, but you look at that primary versus that secondary care in terms of the acute stage of the injury as well. And clearly, like your physical therapists as well as your athletic trainers are going to be across the diagnostics of the injury plus the pathology at such a deep level. That's their background. That's their one wood.
Yeah,
so we need
that's
to
what
trust
they know, like they're gonna exactly.
That's their training, exactly.
Yep.
So we need to trust them. Now, the environments that I've been involved in previously, and I've seen both models. in terms of, well, they can set the parameters and the timeline with regards to the injury. And let's just say it's a hamstring and it's 4 to 6 weeks. And they're telling us where we may rescan it at 4 to 5 weeks or whatever that may be. And then it's going to provide some guidance as to, we think they're ready to go. They've got the biological healing aspect of the tendon or the muscle, whatever, wherever it's at. And then you're looking at obviously the data and the progressions, and then understanding the prescription design, because that's where I see the strength coaches understanding, like speed, change of direction, acceleration drills. The real build up of the mechanics of the program design is absolutely critical, and that's what they do. That's their background. So how you complement obviously that phase of the progression, it's got to be really beneficial, knowing that every situation is going to be different. But when that handover does occur, who has clarity in terms of who's managing what, I think that's what we need to come together to be able to support each other with. But you don't have to hang on to them the whole time as well. You need to have trust in your department to go, well, I think he's ready objectively. He's hit these criteria markers, whether it's on his hamstring strength, where it's on his calf strength, whatever you're looking at, force plate, GPS numbers. Now I'm handing him over because he's back to the head strength coach to be able to manage obviously that element of the program. So providing that there is some kind of system in place, and I think that's important for the staff to be able to really flesh out together. And there's some different systems that are out there. I know I've had exposure to a few through the Australian Institute of Sport previously as to what those systems do look like. And I encourage obviously departments to make sure that they're constantly reviewing what those systems look like as well.
One of the things that, has been talked about on the site before, and something that I'm still trying to wrap my head around, and I think other strength coaches are too, is, how the notion that modern strength and conditioning has created more problems than it's fixed, right? We have all these research and we have all these metrics and continued technology, yet, the incidence of injuries on a whole doesn't always go down. Is it is it the horse, or is it the chicken? Is it the egg? Is it the practitioners? Is it the technology? What do you think? Like, how would you answer that question?
Oh, yeah, it's probably the $1 million piece. It honestly is. And I think, like, having been involved obviously in those cutting edges of performance, mind you, in a very different environment previously, they happen in waves. And for some reason, we had a whole spate of hamstrings in one season, but we think we critically reviewed why that did happen as well, which I think is most of the time does happen post-analysis, unfortunately. And it's like, at the time it did make sense. But I've also been involved in when we had a whole heap of calf strains as well. So I think it goes in waves. And the other aspect, like, I don't know if you guys have experienced, particularly working with collegiate level athletes as well, but when Fortnite first come out, we had a heap of neural hamstrings. And our guys just backs were flared up. Obviously, they come in the next morning, they're assessed on the table, and the physios are jumping up and down saying, yep, they've got sore backs and they've got all these things going on. And we're like, fucking hell, they've been playing Fortnite till 3, 4 o'clock in the morning. Like, no one.
It was Call of Duty for us, but yeah.
So, like, and then obviously to really reflect on that and understand, like, workload and wellness, and we're saying that can they hit speed the next day, and we want them to go through all these progressions. Where do you start? So, look, I think it does go in cycles. I just don't think there is a magic bullet that's ever going to tell us exactly that there's this one thing that's going to solve all of our problems. Again, I go back to, honestly, that conversation on performance management. It's the ability of the teams internally to communicate and make good, justified decisions collectively in order to make sure that a player is available through all of your diagnostic tools. And as long as that is going in a really good direction and it's humming well, that's the way I see, obviously, it working.
One of the the other questions that I got that came up from just talking with you was you talking about the dribbling, and it's another question that has come up, with one of my colleagues, and he talked about it like, look, he was a track athlete, and he says like, look, we spent all this time trying to work on frontside mechanics or whatever it is, because he was running the 4 or the 8, and even with the track athletes he works with now, he's like, how much of dribbling or run mechanic stuff actually matters with team sport athletes? Like, is it enough to shift the needle one way or the other? And I mean, my answer, I know what my answer is, and I believe like, yes, it is. We're slowly going to work on it, because if we're looking at being a developmental school and foundational movements, and we're going to teach it and refine it, so that way, like, we're working you through the progress of your long-term athletic development, and then we can continue to progress those drills and add layers to them. But what do you think about that? Like, again, that's my opinion.
Yeah.
If you disagree, say it. Like, I don't give
no. Like, and it's funny because I know I've had conversations with the guys over here about that, and particularly coming from such a big endurance-based sport. I think Fernando just dropped as well, did he? Is he? He
dropped. I'm sure he'll join back.
All good. Coming from such a big endurance-based sport, like I remember one of my former performance managers is an ex-track and field guy, and ran for Australia. Like, really, he's a gun at what he does in terms of teaching, obviously running mechanics and understanding the way that an athlete is moving biomechanically. What we spoke about is just really prioritizing like movement quality and movement efficiency. So in any opportunity you get, whether it's 15 minutes in a warm-up, whether it's in the weight room and you're able to work on some mechanics, I personally sit on that side of performance, because inevitably it's putting the athlete in good positions. And I know I'm stealing a lot of my ex-boss's thunder in terms of his language, but put them in good positions, which is inevitably going to set them up for decreasing risk of injury. And obviously it's the teaching and learning component that hopefully is ingrained in the athlete's mind enough, because it's been repped and drilled over time.
Yep.
I genuinely think that is what is going to have some transference, but you only may get like 15, 20 minutes, like a couple of times a week, in order to drill these mechanical aspects for the sport. That unfortunately, when they go back to playing their sport, that may go out the window. So I'm really big on just prioritizing movement quality when you can.
Yeah, one of the things that you made me think about with that was, like, again, how much is enough? Like, do you see differentiations between training ages, more or less different times of the year? Like, how would you go about with that?
No, definitely. Like, one of the strategies we used to have with our 1st to 4 year guys, and this is honestly where I see the developmental space across the collegiate level being so critical, and this is probably what I've even had conversations with the MOS guys previously, is what that developmental pathway aspect does look like. So in terms of like your long-term athlete development models, and I'm talking about every area of strength and conditioning, because like if there is a system and a obviously in place to be able to how you periodize that and prioritize that, obviously as a part of the athlete's journey to be able to set them up for success, I think is really critical in terms of your thinking. And that's a role in AFL. So as a practitioner coming through, you are responsible for like 1st to 4 years. So that developmental, that coaching and teaching aspect of the athletes is we really prioritize that, because getting the guys through that age level and to a certain degree, like, it's more challenging because you're dealing with guys who are moving pretty inefficiently, and then you're trying to coach them up and get them ready to perform like big loads over time. The attention to detail that's required on their programming and their progressions requires a lot of thought. So
speaking of progression, and kind of switching gears a little bit, where's been the progression with Catapult? I know a lot of the members, now probably all up and running on Vector. We had S5s for a while, and now we're up fully running with Vectors. Where's been the evolution and the progress over time with the units themselves or with the technology, and again, just whatever you guys are able to offer from a standpoint of Catapult?
Yeah, first shift of gears there too. Well done.
And we're all over the place here, right? Like I said, we're gonna talk this,
I
we're gonna
like
talk
it.
that,
I like
we're gonna
it.
just,
No, that's good.
we're just
Yeah.
flowing.
Oh no, look, man, it's and honestly, it's always evolving. Like from what I've noticed in a sports technology company, and we're always reviewing and trying to push the envelope in terms of hardware, obviously in terms of software as well. No doubt you've seen access to our cloud, and trying to look at how we keep that envelope. Like now, I'm involved in product meetings as a part of like future development, all the way through to what is next in terms of after Vector. So I've seen obviously the evolution. I've only been here for a couple of years in my role, but similar to you, like obviously all the way back from the S5s and GPS sports and beyond. Like there's no
Was it
doubt.
GPS Sport or was it GP Sport? I never which what
GP
did you guys like?
Sport,
GP
Sports,
again, I don't
GP
care. Like, I
Sport,
don't know.
Yeah.
Just
So,
like people in Oregon, you can't call it Oregon. You got to call it Oregon or something. Sorry to anybody listening that's in Oregon. I apologize. I did not mean to upset anybody.
So no, it's definitely continuously evolving in multiple areas. Like you obviously, you just look at the sheer size of the pod. Like how we're actually getting that more and more refined.
I mean, the fact that now that your vectors on and just the normal harnesses themselves snap in and now they collect heart rate right away, like the harnesses and that kind of blew me away. Like I know everybody on staff here was fired up about that.
Yep. No, and I think it's only going to get better. There's definitely some good things coming down the pipeline as well in terms of where we're going with it. I think it has been pretty much released now in terms of our T7 device that's on the way, which would be about a third of the size of a Vector unit. So which has that ability to go obviously. Yeah, to go indoor as well as outdoor capabilities. So we're really excited by that.
Another thing to kind of tease and talk about that you mentioned at the beginning was the video integration, because I know you guys have that. What they teased it at the conference in January. Have you guys made like where are you guys at in that process? Because I mean that sounds pretty exciting. I don't know if you're allowed to talk about it or whatnot, but it seems pretty cool.
Oh no, it's here. It's here definitely in Major League Soccer. We're still doing like as you know, around football is Thunder. So we're still looking at how we build that out over time within football, because from the outside, like we spoke about that high performance aspect before, right? Like the way I see this could potentially go, and I'm not saying it is going to go this way, but it could. Is that ability to take the context, and I'm talking about the game situation or practice and videoing all of that, or even in a return to play continuum. You go out and video someone, if you can integrate this into the one platform and then obviously have some conversations around that with wearable integration and video integration, it's a one-stop shop for everything.
Yeah, that sounds like what Fergus talked about with respect to, understanding the game moments, not like, again, going back to having Catapult versus using it, like, oh, they hit this high speed distance, they didn't run that fast, but it's like, actually, this dude was able to reaccelerate. Yeah, he only got up to 19 miles an hour. However, if you look at the span at which it happened, he accelerated to that 19 miles an hour extremely fast, which we know is important in team sport. And then he didn't need to run much faster because of the context of it. Like it just happened with me and one of the guys. He ran a kickoff return for our first kickoff return for a touchdown, and he never ran faster than 19 miles an hour. But within the context, he never had to, but he was just able to get up to 19 miles an hour faster than everybody else. And then based off the pursuit angles and the lack of the ability to tackle them, like that ability to streamline it all, like you said, can hopefully continue to drive that engine forward.
Yep, and that's essentially like having looked at the product, like that's what you'll be able to look at. Like you're looking at what does the distance look at that speed or velocity band on a 2D pitch animation. So it's kind of like the missing link, as you know, on Catapult. If you're lucky enough to have access to Vector, like you can still go through Google Earth and go through all the detail of actually looking at the mapping of GPS. But to put the context behind this on that 2D pitch animation, I think is just going to add so much more context that is missing in that conversation.
I spoke about it at the conference and have continued to play with it myself. Have you, or as the continued progression of the acceleration profile, how has that gone with you guys with respect to it, and how are you guys continuing to advise customers about that?
Yeah, it's definitely an evolving process. Like, I could honestly probably see something like this coming into the platform over time. At the moment, obviously, as you know, like we've got that set up like on a Google Sheets document where we've got API full integration, which is pretty automated, honestly, like by putting an X next to the activity and then pulling that through. So it's definitely very easy to populate that, understanding like which obviously context of the session you've done, where it's a max velocity or max acceleration.
And that's what I used it for too, right? Like, hey, it's almost like, hey, can you just make sure that you hit the quality that you wanted that day? Like, where's all of your foot contacts? Is it down there in that lower left-hand quadrant, or are we over in the right? Like, did we actually, it's just almost another tool in that toolbox within the Catapult toolbox again, for shitty analogy, but like, did you where are the foot contacts?
Yeah, like, and it's just so many different features, honestly, that we have access to. And the deeper you go into my role, like obviously I'm exposed to so much of our system, but inevitably the way I look at it, half of my job is trying to get access to our customers on the full benefits of our system as well. Because no doubt some people are doing some things at a very high level in Tableau and R and Python, and honestly, which is great, but when I present some of the stuff that we can actually do in our platform, they're like, oh wow, I didn't realize you guys could do that. So, and I build all this beautiful stuff out, and in order to get the same answer. So that obviously for me, like just sitting in this chair is an interesting piece to see it. But inevitably, we've got so many cool features that some of our customers just aren't aware of, and I wasn't aware of as a practitioner as well. So I think like the one area that really excites me based around, I don't know if you've seen this as well, Coach, is looking at Dr. Jason Weber's tool based on speed signature. So he's done basically some, he's put together obviously not only all the maths, but all of the validation behind it as well, which has been released across the board. But he's looking at the kinematic and kinetic breakdown of taking our 10 hertz data and putting it into his script that he's designed. And we're able to look at stride length, stride frequency, ground contact time. We're looking at all of these elements. I know that this has been rolled out for me personally across MLS and collegiate level, as well as our a few NFL clients. But for what I'm seeing in that product, and really assessing an athlete's symmetry and their profile, and what it can actually collate off from using obviously inertial sensors, that for me is just open up a whole other world in terms of performance analytics, that I'm just genuinely excited by the industry. If you haven't seen it, like that's one that's really tickled my fancy.
For those that maybe didn't write it down, but now they reheard it, could you just say that again for them?
It's called Speed Signature. So Dr. Jason Weber is a strength and conditioning coach. He prides himself, like he's had 30 odd years of experience. Like everything that he does is literally, how does it influence the industry? And I think that's why I like him so much. He's just really taking obviously every piece of the performance aspect, and whether it's data or whether it's, but at the end of the day, it's got to influence what I'm actually doing with my athletes. And he's answered those deeper level questions. That he's essentially taking a force plate out onto the field that we haven't looked at previously.
Bringing it back again full circle from there, that it's not about just having it, but using it. Matt, I want to thank you for having you on. For anybody out there that doesn't follow you on social medias, is there anywhere for them to be directed to, or?
A little bit on Instagram, I suppose, but yeah, if anyone obviously wants to make contact, like, yeah, just it's probably just my email, like Matthew.Pell@catapultsports.com. So pretty simple.
Thank you very much, man. This has been a pleasure. I've learned a ton. I took a
Thanks,
ton of
mate.
notes. So yeah, thank you very
Pleasure,
much.
bud. No, thanks for having me, guys. Appreciate it. It's been fun.
See ya.
All right.
Congratulations on making it to the end of the video. Why don't you celebrate by watching more videos just like it? You can also help us on our quest to placate the algorithm gods by liking, sharing, subscribing, and commenting. Thank you.